Hello there, Romans here and welcome to my next music review. Today is going to be Europe Walk the Earth.
Music review. Music review.
Before I even start, I must say that I'm a huge fan of Europe. Europe are for me one of the most interesting bands with one of the most interesting album catalogs ever. Europe have a pretty interesting music history. They actually won a sort of a band competition back in Sweden in 1982 or something like that, and they won among 2000 bands, which resulted in them recording and releasing their first album. Now, their first album wasn't really that good. It was like they were playing some sort of a early heavy metal with some hard rock roots. But of course they were still teenagers, and their second album, Wings of Tomorrow, where they got their keyboard player, Mig Mikaeli, I think, if I pronounce it right, who is with them up until this day. Their second album, Wings of Tomorrow, was already a pretty decent album. It's actually not a decent, it was great. It was a more leaning towards rock music, even though there are some of their heaviest tracks from the older catalog like Scream of Anger or Stormwind. And then, of course, in 1986, Europe released a huge hit, Final Countdown, which is probably one of the most famous songs ever. And along with Carrie, Europe just became one of the most famous bands in the 80s. And Final Countdown is really great album. On Final Countdown, they actually got their current drummer, Jan Hugland, or Hagland, I'm not sure about the pronunciation. And then John Norum left the band, and they released two albums with Key Marcello as a guitar player, and Out of This World from 1988 was just a huge album. I mean, those melodies are as perfect as they can get. Interesting thing was that Joey Tempest, the singer and the frontman of the band, was also the lead songwriter, as he wrote, I'd say 90% of music up at that point. And then in 1991 they released an album called Prisoners in Paradise, which is again one of the best rock albums I've ever heard. It was the first album where they joined forces with a lot of external songwriters, and the result was just massive hard rock album, which is absolutely fantastic. And then Europe broke up. And when they got back together in 2003 or 4, they had the same lineup as the one that recorded Final Countdown, but unfortunately ever since they got back and started releasing their records, their albums pretty much polarized fans, as the music they released since their comeback was nothing like the stuff they did in the 80s. The first album they released was Start from the Dark in 2004, and it really sounds like it was a start from the dark because the band sounded nothing like it did before. It was completely different sound, completely different style, completely different attitude, completely different songs. And of course, many fans didn't necessarily enjoy that album, and even Joey Tempest said in a couple of interviews that he wanted to take Europe as a sort of a new band. And in the mid-2000s, many of the bands were doing more heavier music, like for example Bon Jovi with their Bounce, where they got D-dropped guitars, at least at a few songs. There were many other bands that in mid-2000s tried to play heavier music, like for example Alice Cooper with his Brutal Planet. Start from the Dark was really a record that musically was more like a post-grunge. It was a very dark, very heavy record where Europe pretty much played music that became popular a couple of years after they broke up. And even though I don't really think that Start from the Dark was an exceptional album, I think that a couple of the songs were really very good. And they took that concept and improved it on every level with another record called Secret Society, which is a record not really appreciated and liked by fans, but it's one of the best records I've ever heard, one of the most influential albums for me as a songwriter. As a singer, I actually learned a lot practicing those songs from that album. I just love it a lot. It's such a fantastic album. It was like, again, pretty much like a modern rock, with a lot of D-dropped riffs. And of course, I got very excited about what kind of record they were gonna do next. I kind of wanted them to continue that trend, but in 2009 they released a record called Last Look at Eden, which Joey Tempest called as a modern retro album. And I think it's a very... because the whole record was like these 70s riffs with a lot of epic keyboards. I think that Last Look at Eden was a pretty solid album. There were a couple of really exceptional songs. At that time, I was a little disappointed because I wanted them to kind of continue in the style of Secret Society. So for me, it was a step back. It was actually such a big step back that that record sounds less modern than any of their records. Even their 80s stuff sound more modern because they are 80s, and this record was more like 70s. And I think that this album, Last Look at Eden, pretty much showed what influences Europe had, because Europe were never very secretive about their influences. They always said that the bands that influenced them the most, and the bands that they probably grew up on listening to, were Deep Purple, Led Zeppelin, UFO, Thin Lizzy, and so on. And this was the first album where you could hear all of their influences. And from that moment on, they pretty much continued that way, with A Bag of Bones being pretty much like a Europe's version of Deep Purple. I actually loved Bag of Bones a lot. It was a fantastic record. Then War of Kings had some, again, some 70s riffs with some Black Sabbath influence. That was actually a funny thing when I thought about Not Supposed to Sing the Blues was like Europe's version of Deep Purple, then War of Kings was Europe's version of Black Sabbath. And the title track of the new album, Walk the Earth, was like the Europe's version of Led Zeppelin for me. Even before I start with the new album, Walk the Earth, I must say that the new album is really great. I've heard it 5 times already. It's coming out tomorrow. I've heard it for the first time actually today. When it comes to the songwriting, I would say that most of the album feels like the up-tempo, epic, heavy rock music with some Oriental influences. Even the title track, Walk the Earth, it has that kind of a Led Zeppelin, Kashmir kind of vibe, especially because of the keyboards. I don't know why. And it's got the intro that reminded me a little bit of the song Human After All from Secret Society. I like how epic the whole record is. It's really something new from them. For example, the second song, The Siege, is just such a dark and heavy track. I'd say that probably this new album is much heavier than anything they released after Secret Society, and this is what I really like about this album. So the song The Siege reminded me a little bit of Let the Children Play from Secret Society. Then for example, the song Pictures is a song that has that sort of a 70s electric light orchestra vibe. My girlfriend actually said, listening to that song, that it reminds her of King Crimson, so kind of like space rock kind of thing. For example, the song Wolves has that doom metal or doom rock, like Black Sabbath kind of riff played on the guitar with a fuzz. The whole song sounds like a combination of doom metal or doom rock and grunge, like Alice in Chains, which is a pretty interesting combination. The last song, Turn to Dust, is another song that has a very slow Black Sabbath-ish kind of riff with some Whitesnake as an influence as well. And the interesting thing is that the song ends pretty drastically, which means that sometimes when bands can't really find a way how to end a song in a way to maintain that atmosphere and that mood, they simply fade out the song. And this song also has the similar ending, just it doesn't fade out. So it means that the song goes and suddenly, very drastically, the song ends. Something similar was done by Dream Theater on their Pull Me Under song. And then you've got a couple of seconds of nothing, and then you get what seemed to be like some kind of a jazz band playing in 40s or 50s, some kind of a jazz/swing music. I'm not sure if they actually recorded that, but it's a very light-hearted ending of the album. Another thing to mention is that when I listen to music, I'm a very visual listener, which means that I see a lot of colors and I have a lot of images in my head when I listen to music. And when I was listening to this album, I always pictured desert, sand. The whole record, even though not many songs are necessarily Oriental, it just has that sort of a Prince of Persia kind of image for me. Maybe I would pick a different cover for the album, but yet again, it may be just my interpretation of the album. When it comes to the lyrics, you can find out on the internet what the lyrics are about. They have a lot of different songs lyrically. There are even some traces of political lyrics on the album. This comes from the original idea of Joey Tempest. He actually wanted this album to be a concept album, but he realized that Europe is not really that kind of band, so they decided to not do a concept album, but you can hear some political influences, like for example in the song Election Day. The song Pictures has a interesting lyrics It is a continuation of the story that started on the song Final Countdown. Another song I didn't mention is GTO, that I really like for slightly adventurous Joey's vocal performance. Now the thing is that there is a huge difference between how he sounded as a singer back in the 80s and how he sounds now. So back in the 80s his voice was very smooth, like especially the Final Countdown, which has one of the best vocal performances ever, where his voice is like this sort of a purple silk, I don't know how else to put it. It's just such a beautiful tone of his voice. And in the past he seemed to be stretching towards the limitations of his vocal range, especially the ending of the Final Countdown as the song. Up until this day it's one of the biggest mysteries for me. I don't know how he was able to record those high notes in that song, because he was never able to do that live. He never even attempted to do that. So I was always wondering, like, how could he do that in the studio? Because it's not like in the 80s you could do there were too many studio tricks that you could pull out. He had to do that, and as a singer I know that being able to sing those notes means that you have to be able to have that vocal technique to reach those notes. And there is just no other way around it. And he seems to have that technique, because it's not like he was pushing his voice. He was never able to do that, so I don't know where is the trick. But as of now, his voice is just so much more mature and more bluesy, and his vocal range diminished a little bit, which you can hear in many of the old classics when they sing them live. One of the best examples is Ready or Not, which they sing a couple of notes lower than the original, and even then he's not able to reach all those higher notes. And what I like about this song, GDO, is that he slightly goes towards the limitations of his vocal range right now. It reminds me a little bit of the song The Beast from Last Look at Eden, where he did something similar with his voice. I don't want to say which version of him is better, the 80s or his current voice. I think they both sound very good. And this is what I really must say about this band, that they have so much class. I don't know how else to put it, or how to explain that, but it's like if somebody told me that the band members of Europe have noble ancestors, I would believe them. If somebody told me that Europe are offsprings of some kings, I'd say, yeah, that's pretty much, I don't know, they have so much class, they age gracefully, and they play classical rock in such a magnificent way. They are really what I'd call a rock royalty. I think even before this album came out, you could, in a way, predict what kind of music they were going to do after the last three releases, and they pretty much continue what they started. But I like that all of their records, their whole discography is just so different. And one of the most interesting things is that back in the 80s, Europe were one of the most definitive bands of the 80s. With their Final Countdown and with their keyboards, they were one of the bands who combined rock music with the keyboards, like Bon Jovi or Van Halen before them. And in the late 80s, most of the bands that were playing hard rock were having keyboard players. And I like that they never really looked back and they never revisited that 80s style, and they just keep on playing whatever they want, and their music is just so great. They are one of the most influential bands for me as a songwriter, and I just love their development. They are really one of the most interesting bands in terms of their music development. When it comes to the final score, I was really thinking between 9 and 10 points. It usually takes me a longer time. I have to see if the album can stand the test of time, but I decided to give this album 10 points out of 10. I already gave 10 points to the new album from Leprous, and this is one of the best albums and one of the biggest surprises for me. When it comes to their last three albums, I personally prefer The Bag of Bones, but I think that this album may be their best since Secret Society, so this is really a masterpiece. When it comes to recommendations, it's kind of difficult with Europe, because there are many fans who, when you say Europe, imagine their 80s stuff, and Prisoners in Paradise is the last album they've heard from them. Then you've got fans who maybe prefer their newer stuff, then you've got fans like me who like all of their music. So I think that if you liked previous three albums, you will love this one. If you like only their 80s stuff, then get over yourself and start listening to other stuff as well. If you've never listened to Europe, I strongly recommend going through all of their albums. They're just fantastic band. Walk the Earth in Slovak means kráčať zem. Kind of doesn't make sense in Slovak. Maybe it's out of the context. I hope you liked this review. If you did, don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe. You can follow me on Instagram or on Facebook. You can find the links in the description below. If you have heard the album already, let me know in the comment section below. How did you like it? And if there are any bloopers at the end, you can enjoy them. So thanks for watching.
Music review.
Keyboard player, Mikaeli, I think. Again, honey.
It wasn't me.
So where they, for me, who plays that rock, čo je?
Muška tak preletela.
Who upon, there are many, to bude v blooperoch.